And now comes the railroad. So now, with fights raging all over the plains, the Union Pacific was about to cut into Plains Indians' land. Well, at least the UP had solved its labor problem. When the Civil War ended in April 1865, thousands of Army veterans headed west in search of work on the railroads. So did lots of Irish immigrants and former slaves. With 10,000 workers, the UP started building more than a mile of track a day across the Great Plains. Crews of ironmen laid down the 700-pound iron rails, then teams of spikers came up behind them to hammer in spikes, holding the rails in place. Rolling along at the end of the track was a long supply train, really more like a town on wheels. There were train cars with warehouses, blacksmith shops, butchers, and kitchens, and several with bunk beds. A teenage worker named Erastus Lockwood said the bunks were covered with fleas, so he and his friends preferred to sleep on the roof of the train. By October 1866, the UP tracks reached nearly 250 miles west of Omaha. Thomas Durant decided this called for a big party, and he invited politicians and investors to come celebrate the progress. Bands and magicians entertained the guests, while chefs prepared a menu of Western specialties, such as buffalo tongue and braised bear in port wine. Then everyone went to sleep in fancy tents with mattresses. Durant's guests were having a great time until the next morning. It was then, according to the UP engineer Silas Seymour, that the partygoers were startled from their slumbers by the most unearthly whoops and yells of the Indians. People stuck their heads out of their tents and were terrified to see Indians running through the camp, shouting and waving tomahawks. They were relieved to realize that this was all part of the party. These were Pawnees, allies of the Americans. Durant had paid them to put on this little show. He wanted his guests to feel like they had experienced the real live Wild West. The tourists went home happy, and the Union Pacific continued building across the Great Plains. But as the workers moved farther west, they started laying tracks into the territory of powerful Plains Indians nations such as the Lakota, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho. These groups were in no mood to join a celebration for the railroad through their land. This time, for real. Already alarmed by white settlers, gold seekers, and wagon roads, the Plains Indians saw the advancing railroad as the biggest threat yet to their way of life. They watched hunters hired by the Union Pacific shoot thousands of buffalo to feed railroad workers, and they knew the railroad would bring more soldiers and settlers to the plains. In August 1867, near Plum Creek in Nebraska, a Cheyenne named Porcupine was riding with a group of warriors when they saw a train for the first time. We looked at it from a high ridge, he remembered. Far off it was very small, but it kept coming and growing larger all the time, puffing out smoke and steam. After the train passed, the men rode down to the tracks to take a closer look. We talked of our troubles, Porcupine said. We were feeling angry and said among ourselves that we ought to do something. The warriors yanked down the telegraph wire that ran along the train track. They used it to tie a few heavy pieces of wood across the tracks. Then they sat by the tracks and waited. Soon after dark, they heard a rumbling sound. It was getting louder. "It's coming," Porcupine said.